All right, let's get started. So homework 2 is posted. I just noticed my typo here. I have homework 2 twice on there. I'll fix that at some point. But homework 2, I have to warn, not as much as last semester's, I guess, but there is a difficulty spike from homework 1 to homework 2. Please plan your time accordingly and prepare for this homework. Which the difficulty spike is more, I think it's more perceived, how do I want to word this, is the grades go down. I don't think there's too much of a difficulty spike, and I'll try to highlight in lecture and through lecture questions the common mistakes students make on homework 2, more so than I have in past semesters. Without lecture questions, a lot of students wouldn't show up to lecture, wouldn't watch the lectures, or watch them at 2 times speed, and then run into those roadblocks, run into those pitfalls during the homework. So I'm confident we can do even better this semester and not really feel that much of a difficulty spike. But the big thing for this one is using a form. So using a form to send data to the server and then hosting all of that data on the server. That's the big overarching theme of this homework, of building what we call a dynamic site. In homework 1, it was mostly just, okay, here's the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Have fun, look at our site. And then we built an API where they could hit the API endpoints to add data to the API and then retrieve data from the API. But they couldn't really interact with each other in a more meaningful way. Let me try lower lights here. But they couldn't really interact with the site in a more meaningful way through the front end. Your users couldn't use the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the front end, without using the API and sending put and post requests manually. Now we want to build a site where they can interact with your website to interact with each other and have the content of the site being dynamic and built by the users. To that end, we're effectively going to build an image bulletin board where users can post an image and a caption. So we're going to let users upload a file, which for our purposes will be JPEG images, and comments associated with that file, and post an image, a meme or whatever, with a caption, and then just communicate that way. And then the objectives walk through that one at a time to be able to get all of this functionality. I don't think there's anything else I really want to say. Any questions on this before I just get into some lecture content? I think at least for now, that's all I want to highlight on the homework. The big difficulty there is getting the image uploads to work, especially with large image files. We'll talk about buffering. We'll talk about receiving an HTTP request where part of the body of the request is an image, which is bytes, which cannot be translated into a string, can't be decoded as a string. So we have to parse the request into parts before decoding into strings. So that's the big trick with this. How do we do that? And that's what we'll talk about for about 3 weeks. And I apologize, I forgot to convert these to dark mode. I don't know if it's better with the lights higher. Do we like it better like this? Like this, since it's in light mode slides? Okay. It's going to be pretty bright today. It's giving me a headache too. But it's too early in the day to be this bright. But I'll try to remember to do dark mode slides. I had a busy weekend getting this and the 116 homework ready, and then forgot to do dark mode slides. All right, so let's talk about front-end development. We have a week of front-end development. I'm probably going to squish that down into 2 days. This isn't a front-end course, but there's just very little things that we need to talk about in terms of front-end development. We're going to knock it all out in probably 2 lectures, and then start the form content on Friday. So today we want to talk about HTML and CSS, and I'm going to try to get JavaScript in there as well. So HTML is going to be the structure of the page. That's like the foundation of any website is the HTML. And then CSS is going to sprinkle some styling on top of that. So let's talk about these. And I assume you've probably seen both of these in several classes and on your own, just studying web stuff. You've probably come across these. So I don't want to spend too much time on either of these. But I do want to just highlight, just so we're all on the same page, just so we all understand what HTML is. Let's talk about what it is for a little bit. It's a hypertext markup language. The hypertext means that documents can link to each other. So the idea that we can have a link in a web page is part of HTML. That's the hypertext part of HTML. And then markup language, it gives us ways to mark certain parts of the content as different things. We can have a list using a list tag. We can have a paragraph, etc., a div. We can mark up the text instead of just having basically a .txt file. We can mark it up in some way to stylize and organize the content. HTML is not a programming language. If somebody says they program in HTML, they're technically wrong. And they're not programming. You don't program in HTML. So here's some basic HTML. If you save this text in a file with a .html extension and double-click it, this web page is going to load up, minus the border. The border's for the slide. So the core of HTML is built on HTML elements. These elements are defined by an open and a closing tag, and anything in between those tags are part of that element, and elements can be nested. So here we have a body element, the start of a body element, the end of a body element, and everything in between. Why does it highlight in like that? And everything in between is the content of that body element. The content of that contains an H1 or a header 1 element, a paragraph element, and a div element with no content. So using elements, this is how we're marking up text. We're marking up the content of this page to say this is a header, this is a paragraph, this is an empty div. There are lots of different types of elements. I'm not going to go through them all. At the end of my HTML content, I'm just going to say go to W3 Schools. It's got fantastic tutorials, or any other online resource you want. I'm not going to belabor it and go through every single HTML element. It's not technically interesting. There's not like some juicy tech content. It's just going through, here's a list, here's a table. And you've probably, like I said, you've probably all seen that before. Not going to waste time in a 300 level class going through that. There are only a few that we'll really need that I'll highlight. Some elements can be self-closing. If we have a slash at the end, that means that there's no open and close tag. This is a line break, a horizontal rule. There's no open and close tag. The tag itself is just one element fully defined in a single tag. We put a slash to denote that it's self-closing. Though browsers are very forgiving with your HTML syntax, if you don't have that slash, it's still going to put a new line there. It's still going to be a self-closing tag. Images as well. If you have an image, if you're embedding an image onto your page, that's a self-closing tag. You just put an IMG tag, an IMG element. You don't need an open tag and a closing tag for that. If you do have an image, you need a source attribute to denote what image is being displayed. You've already seen that in the sample site from Homework 1, and you'll be using this in Homework 2 quite extensively. So what's an attribute? I just mentioned attributes before I introduced them. An attribute, so HTML elements can have any number of attributes, which are key value pairs, which add extra information to that element. So for example, in my div, I have an attribute named ID with a value of my div. So I'm saying this div has a property of ID equal to my div. In the previous slide, we had an image with a property of src for source of slides.png, saying the image can be found at this relative URL. So go back to the server and request, make a GET request for the path slides.png, and then you'll be able to get that content added to this page. Is referring to W3 schools considered an AI violation? So if you're, and yes, in general, the MDN would be safer. But even that, either one of those could cross the line. If you're using it for reference to learn how things work, that's always fine. If you're going to either one of these resources and just copy, paste into your submission, that's never okay. Unless it's, there are some exceptions. If it's, I don't know, only this much. You're saying, okay, I don't feel like typing out title, and you're cut and pasting like a word or something. Fine. But if you're cut and pasting a whole example from any resource online, that's crossing that line. And at that point, you did commit an AI violation. The only question is, will I catch you or not when you're doing stuff like that? In general, I mean, it's hard to catch you doing that. It takes a lot of time and effort if you're copying code from the internet. But if two of you do that, well, now the cheating detection tools I run are going to catch you. I'm going to see two students with similar code. I don't even care that you both got it off the internet. I just see two students with the same code who copied the same example off Stack Overflow, and now I don't even care what happened. I got two students with the same code. I know something happened that was a violation, and that's usually how you get caught when you're copying things off the internet. That's usually how it happens. But as long as you're not copying code, like big chunks of code, you're fine. Use whatever resources you want, whatever examples you want. It's a skill you're going to have by the time you graduate, because that's honestly what like 80% of software engineering is just looking up documentation, looking up examples, learning from those examples, and then taking what you learned and then applying it to your project. That's like a lot of what you do as a software engineer. So if you graduate without those skills, you're going to be at a disadvantage when you get out there in the working world. So I'm never going to say, no, only use my course content. Told fish. Every HTML is the same, so aren't we copying someone? That's like AI violation for hello world. Not quite sure I understand. I mean, not every HTML page is the same. Every HTML page is going to have a similar structure to this. But you can always copy code that I show you in lecture. My code you can copy, it's fair game. And I already gave you an example of that. So if I see this structure, like even if I'm going to say, oh, you copied doc type HTML language English from the internet, I'm just going to say you copied it from my slides, and that's fine. So this basic structure that's always the same is fine. Because I'm always going to show you that kind of stuff. Like the basic structure of a socket server in Python. I showed you that in lecture. It's going to be the same everywhere. Even in my lecture example, I have a reference in my code that says this is the documentation where I got this from, which, it's modified from that documentation, but it's all based on that. That's perfectly fine. You briefly explain the difference between XHTML and HTML briefly. To be honest, I can't. I forgot that XHTML was a thing. I think XHTML was like a new standard that added new elements. And this is what I believe. I'm not 100% on this. I believe XHTML just added new elements, and it was so cool that they decided, let's call it something else. And then what is XHTML? We just call HTML, I think. Can anybody confirm or deny that? The difference between XHTML and HTML, I think they're the same thing, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Because I think it was like they added to HTML and just called it XHTML. And now we're just like, why are we saying the X? Let's just call it HTML. Same with HTML5. A whole bunch of new elements were added to it. And they called it HTML5 because it was this new thing. And now we just call it HTML because why say the 5? Why say the X? It's all just HTML to me. Yeah, the X was like for XML. But HTML has always had similar syntax to XML, but it is not, in fact, XML. Extensible. Thank you for that, Hannah. XHTML is stricter, more XML-based version of HTML. I need XML applications. Okay. All right. And for any front-end questions, I'll pull my cheat card and just say, talk to Alan. Go ask Alan Hunt. He's your front-end guy. Or take 370. Front-end questions, I'm always going to be more fuzzy on because it's a back-end course. I teach back-end stuff. That's where I want to focus. Comments in HTML, for what it's worth, only block comments, no line comments. And this is the syntax. Less than, exclamation point, dash, dash starts a block comment. Dash, dash, greater than ends a block comment. We can put Unicode directly in our HTML. We can either like cut and paste the characters directly, that's fine. Or we can use the escaped characters if we actually give the hex code using ampersand, hashtag, and then the hex code, this being a 2-byte character, the bytes 98 in hex and then 20 in hex is going to be this rook character. We can embed that directly in using the escaped Unicode. Or we can use some special characters. There are some named Unicode variables, characters, that we can use their names so we don't have to remember for the common ones we use, like non-breaking space, which we want to add an extra space right here. We don't have to remember the Unicode byte value for that. We just use the named NBSP, non-breaking space. Another one, right arrow. LT for less than sign, GT for greater than sign. When we're escaping HTML, those are going to be important. AMP for ampersands. So HTML will ignore extra white space. If this were, what I have highlighted, if this were replaced by 100 spaces, it's still only going to show one single space. So if we do want a little extra spacing, and with emphasis on a little, if we just want a little bit extra spacing, we can add an extra non-breaking space. This is going to be space, then a non-breaking space, then another space. We're going to end up getting 3 spaces by putting this non-breaking space with 2 spaces on each side. So if you want just a little bit more room, you can add a non-breaking space. At the point where you're cut and pasting non-breaking space, non-breaking space, non-breaking space, and you got like 12 of them, get a better solution. You can add a span with a width. Using the width property, use some CSS to get your spacing that way. But if you just need a little bit, sprinkling in a non-breaking space is perfectly fine. I'm sure there's front-end developers out there who will say, never use a non-breaking space, but I'm not going to be that strict. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say about HTML. There will be a few elements, specifically form next week, that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth, form and input, but only in the context of how to use them to send requests to the server. But that's it. HTML, open tags, closing tags. Some tags can be self-breaking. Those all define elements, HTML elements. And elements can have attributes as key value pairs. That's about it. That's all I really want to talk about. And one element, when we talk about CSS next, one element that is very useful to us is the ID element, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I like W3 Schools. Nothing wrong with that. If you like a different resource, head to a different resource too. But if you ever need HTML, especially for this course or whatever, I usually give you all the HTML in the handouts, the homework handouts, but there still will be some that you'll have to write yourself. It's very minimal in this course. And especially for your project, of course, you'll have to write some HTML, write some front-end stuff. All right, let's style our pages. We're going to rip right through front-end stuff. So HTML defines the structure of your page. CSS is going to style it and make it look good. It's good practice to have your CSS and HTML in separate files and your JavaScript also in a separate file instead of putting everything in one HTML file. We want to separate our concerns. This is just good software engineering principles, ideas, is we want to keep the structure of our page separate from how it's being styled. So we can use the same HTML with different CSS files if we want to style our page differently. You can see this, thanks to Nicholas, actually, on the CSE 312 web page. To go into dark mode, it's one HTML file. The HTML just defines a structure. That's the same always. But there's two different CSS files, and dark mode swaps out the CSS file. So that's something that's much harder to do if all of our style is just mixed in with our HTML. You keep those separate. It's easier to add features like that, to be able to get things, be able to maintain our code base is much easier. And then keeping the JavaScript, the actual functionality of the page, separate from the structure and the style, again, helps us maintain our code. And then also keeping the data, as we'll see later this week or next week, we'll keep the data separate from our structure, style, and functionality as well with HTML templates. So the structure, how the data is structured, is separate from the actual data we want to display. HTML templates are going to give us a way to do that. I don't really have you do any front-end stuff except for the project, so this mostly applies to the project. But this ain't an art class. You're never going to be graded on the styling and look and feel of your page. As long as everything works, that's what we're focused on in this class. Out there in the real world, you should definitely care about your front end much, much more. There are big reasons to care about that, most notably accessibility. You want to make sure that everybody can access your page, use your page. For that, again, I'm deferring to Alan Hunt in CSE 370. He'll teach you all about that. Human-computer interaction. How does a human being interact with your page? In this class, we're worried about the back-end functionality. So I'm never going to say, you get a worse grade because your website looks like crap. I'm not going to say that. Plus, the examples I'll give will all look like crap. So I can't judge you on that if I'm going to make crappy sites. All right, so let's talk about CSS. CSS is going to look like this. You'll have your .css file. And for each element type that you want to style, you'll put the type of that element. So I'm going to say the body, there will only be one of these, should have a background color of aqua. Every paragraph, there might be many of these, every paragraph should be colored red with big font. I don't have a whole lot else to say about that. That's the syntax. With this styling and this HTML, this is what our page is going to look like. We have a body with a background of aqua. Our text was big and red for the paragraphs, there's only one. And whenever we have a style sheet, we have to link it, typically in the head. I've never seen it anywhere else, but in the head, you're going to add a link element, which is going to say, hey, I got a style sheet. Here's the name of it. Talk to the server and get this style.css. So once this part of the HTML is parsed, the browser is going to make another request for style.css to your server. Your server is going to say, oh, style.css. I got that right here for you. Send a response, get the style. Browser is going to say thanks, and then apply that styling to the page. So that's a little restrictive. What if we don't want every single paragraph to be big red text? What if we have two paragraphs, we want one to be red, one to be green? How do we make this a little more flexible? For that, we're going to use classes. So CSS will support classes. If we give each of these paragraphs or any HTML element a class attribute, that's going to apply class-specific styling to those elements. So I'm saying every paragraph, then use the dot, every paragraph that has class of red, its color should be red. Every paragraph with a class of green should be green. So this gives us more control, more flexibility. If you ever use something like Bootstrap, Bootstrap heavily uses classes. You just add a class name to your elements, and then all of Bootstrap CSS says, oh, that class, I know what to do with that class, and applies all the styling of that class defined in its CSS file to that element. If we want a class name to span across multiple element types, just leave off the element type. .green says every element with a class of green, regardless of what type of element, should have green text. And I didn't know. Oops. So this is going to be green, even though we never said p.green should be green text. We did say p.red is red text, so this will be red, but this div, not red, because only red paragraphs are going to be red. We didn't say anything about divs. We didn't say anything about the red class in general, so that div will not be red. And finally, we can single out specific elements using the ID attribute. This is something we'll do extensively in JavaScript as well. We're going to have an ID attribute. These have to be unique. So if I give this div an ID of my div, I can't give any other element an ID of my div. I mean, I can, and your page will still load because browsers are very forgiving with our mistakes in HTML and CSS, but things won't work the way we expect them to. And you'll get errors if you're using an ID. But your page will still load. So give it an ID of my div, and I want to style just that element, hashtag, and then the ID of that element. That's going to let you style just one single element. And I said finally on the last slide, but additionally, we can have multiple classes separate them by a space. So I have two classes here. Regardless of what element, if it has class of green, color it green. Regardless of what element, if it has class wide, set the width to 100%. So I have a wide green div with ID my div here. And that'll have both properties applied to it. Linked lists are cool. Yeah, you learn it yourself. I don't expect you to know. I don't require you to know HTML coming into this class. I suspect that most of you do, but I don't. It's not required. So if you don't know HTML, or if there's parts of HTML that you'll need that you don't know, I do expect you to look up resources. That's right at the top of the syllabus. I do expect you to be able to find resources, understand those resources online. That's a skill that at this point in your career, I mean, there's no getting around it. You just have to have that. It's tough to build that skill in classes when we try to present absolutely everything you need in the lectures. But it is something you have to get. So I try to strategically get that in places like HTML. I don't think that's hard to pick up on your own. So it's easy for me to leave that one as an exercise to the reader, so to say. But that said, I don't think I require any HTML that I don't show you in later lectures anyway. So I don't even think I follow through with that. Like you'll need to know how to use forms, but I go in depth in forms next week. Like I show you all that stuff anyway. So I don't even think you have to. CSS, I don't even require you to use CSS at all. If you don't use any CSS in the whole class, it's fine. The only exception was homework 1, but I gave you the CSS file. You didn't have to do anything about it. The one place I really require you to look up documentation is on the project for the reports. That's where you're really getting practice with that. But even then, students find loopholes for that. There's a pretty blatant loophole for that. Is Stack Overflow a valid resource? I mean, yeah, as long as you're not copying code, absolutely. Can I tell you something, guys? Everyone, I use Stack Overflow every day. It's a beautiful resource. It's a fantastic resource. I don't cut and paste code from Stack Overflow. I know a lot of developers, professional developers who do, and they defend it, and they say it's okay to do that. I'm not going that far. But geez, most of my coding, like you just cut and paste an error in your IDE. Stack Overflow is usually one of the top results, and I'm going to get a nice dialogue and answers and everything. It's a fantastic resource. Just don't cut and paste code from it. Stack Overflow, for what it's worth, and my argument against, one of my arguments against people in industry who say, oh yeah, just cut and paste code. Aside from you should understand what the hell your own code does if you're going to put it in your project and you don't understand how it works. That's just asking for mystery bugs that you don't know how to debug because you don't even understand your own code. And by the way, what are people even paying you for? But aside from that, Stack Overflow, all the code in any post, any user posts on there is copyrighted. You legally can't copy code from Stack Overflow. If you look into their copyright at the bottom of the page, all of their posts, any post from any user, they reserve the rights to that. It's basically Stack Overflow's property. You're not allowed to use it. Bless you. It's not open source. It's no open source licenses on that. So you could even be looking at legal trouble. If you have a successful app, you're making millions of dollars, and Stack Overflow says, wait, that's all my code. They can go after you for that. They can take your money legally. All right, and I wanna get this out of the way first. This one is in dark mode, so now it's going to be harder to read. Okay. PHP sounds cool. PHP, I have opinions, but I think PHP is a really great language if you're a beginner web dev, but eventually you'll hit a point where it's just restrictive, in my opinion. That said, I haven't touched PHP in over a decade, so it's possible the language, I heard the language has evolved a bit with Laravel, I believe it is. I think that's a really nice framework that alleviates a lot of the problems that existed a long time ago. Oh yeah, that too, Plain Puck says. If you read an answer, like Stack Overflow is not always right. It's just the community having a dialogue. They're not always right. So if you go to Stack Overflow and you get the wrong answer, I'm not liable for that. Go to the official docs. Go to right to the RFC if you want the answer. That will be the answer. If there's anything where you follow the RFC and you lose points or whatever, or I say something that contradicts the RFC always wins. The RFC wins over me every day. So if you follow the RFC, you're always right. All right, everyone good on this? Anyone need more time? Okay. All right, let's move right along. Talk about JavaScript, and we'll get all the front-end stuff out of the way. And I might rearrange a few of the next lectures. I've been meaning to change the schedule a little bit because it's not until next week, Monday, that I start covering content that you need for the homework, and I want to do that earlier. I might do that starting Wednesday, and then move the rest of my front-end stuff to the last two lectures of this block of 3 weeks. Under CCBYSA. You must give credit. I think that's the part. You can't just cut and paste in your code. You must give credit, indicate the changes you've made. And I believe I thought there was attribute. Oh, yeah, it is right. It's the one I just read. And it's a copy left. So if you paste a bunch of Stack Overflow code into your project, it is copy left You have to use the same copyright where people can use it with attribution. But you can copy and redistribute it. Okay. So it's a little different than what I was remembering. So you can use it, but you have to attribute. And you have to copy, it is copyleft, which means you have a bunch of Stack Overflow code in your project, attribute Stack Overflow, and the users who posted that code, you have to do the same thing. You can't have that and say, okay, this is proprietary now. You have to let other people use that with attribution to yourself and the other people. Equivalent JavaScript? I don't know what you're saying, Plain Plug, but if you were saying a resource for JavaScript, honestly, I like W3 Schools again. W3 Schools has a good JavaScript example. Oh, I have it right on the screen. So let's do JavaScript 2. Let's get through these slides. And then my other front-end lectures, I can just do demos and examples. We can go to the browser, break some pages, build some browser extensions, some of the fun stuff, more fun stuff. So JavaScript, again, I'm not going to thoroughly cover JavaScript syntax. I assume you can pick up a language pretty easily by the time you make it to this course. At least the basics, as much JavaScript as you'll need in this class, which, again, it's front-end, very little JavaScript that you'll actually need. And that said, with all these, by the way, you can always ask me outside of lecture. Whenever I say this, I'm not covering. That means I'm not covering in lecture. If you come to office hours and you go to office hours and you say, how do I make a list in HTML? I'll happily explain it to you and help you out. I just mean I won't cover it in lecture. So with JavaScript, this is where we finally get some functionality in our pages. This is where we can get some dynamic content where things are changing, moving around. The big thing we'll use JavaScript for is to make asynchronous requests to the server. And it just makes things more alive, more dynamic. Without JavaScript, with just HTML and CSS, you can't do much. You can display information, static information to the user. And to change that information, the user has to refresh the page to get more extra information. So HTML and CSS are not programming languages. Somebody called me out on this, so I had to add this to my slide about a year ago. Technically, HTML and CSS combined are a programming language. That becomes a programming language. It is Turing complete. So I have to add that exception every time I show this slide. But you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't use them as a programming language. JavaScript is a programming language. So JavaScript, this is going to give us our loops, our variables, all that good stuff. So we can actually write code in the front end of our web pages. Now let's think about that for a second. A user visits your page, downloads your JavaScript, downloads your HTML, CSS, JavaScript. All of that is on their machine. You visit a page, you're downloading all of this stuff to your machine, and then you're running their JavaScript. You run their JavaScript code on your computer. This is exactly what we call a code injection attack. Like somebody gets to inject code into your machine and get their code running on your machine. That's how the internet works. You just download their JavaScript and run it on your machine. Obvious security concerns with this. We don't want people destroying everything just because we clicked on their link. We don't want them destroying our machines. So big security implications. So JavaScript is a little bit restricted in what it can do. The big thing it can't do, I mean, aside from can't access other tabs or windows, should be pretty obvious. We want to definitely restrict that. JavaScript can only affect the DOM of the page that you're currently viewing, the page that requested that JavaScript, and can't access your data from other sites, not directly anyway. There are ways to hijack cookies that we'll talk about later in the course. But the big one that you might not be expecting, might not think about right away, is that it can't read or write files. Of course, we don't want anybody doing this. If somebody downloads JavaScript for a page and that JavaScript navigates your whole directory, your whole hard drive, and just reads everything and sends information back to the server. We definitely don't want that happening. So the answer is just to not let JavaScript read files. Where we really have to think about this is your JavaScript code can't read your own files. So if you want to write some JavaScript that reads and modifies your CSS, you can't do that. Can't do it. Can't read and write files. If you want a separate file that stores your data, you want to serve a .json file and link that to the front end and have your JavaScript read that JSON file, can't do that. Can't do it. It's not allowed. Not even files that came from your server. You can't even read those files. So when you're developing, you got to keep that in mind that there are certain things you just can't do because of this restriction. We need this restriction for security reasons. It's a very important thing to have, but just keep that in mind. You can't even read your own files that were served from your own server on the user's front end. Can't do it. So whenever you have a need for something like that, you have to find some other way to do that. Make an AJAX call, get the data, and then parse it right away without saving it to a file is a common way to do that. All right, let's see just the bare bones of very simple JavaScript examples. This is something that I'll use quite a bit in this class. I'm going to get an element by ID. That ID that we add to those HTML elements is going to be really handy for JavaScript. I'm going to get an element by ID, and that's going to give me an object that represents one of my HTML elements in the DOM. I don't think I ever define DOM in these slides, but the DOM, the document object model, it's basically the data structure of your HTML page, all the nesting of the elements. That structure we call the DOM. So I'm going to get this element out of the DOM, get a reference to that object, and then I can edit that content however I want. So this is from the somewhat from the sample site. I think it's a little different, and I have the emoji at the end. But if I do .inner HTML, this is a variable that stores all of the content of that element, and I can overwrite it. I can append to it, anything I can do with a string. I can append to it, I can overwrite it, I can read it. Here I'm going to overwrite whatever was in my div. I'm going to set it equal to this string and add content dynamically to my site using JavaScript. So I'm editing the HTML using JavaScript. I had something in my head. I'm like, oh man, that's really important. I gotta not forget to say it. And then I forgot. So there's something really cool that we're missing, but we'll survive. And we want to import our JavaScript, import in quotes, our JavaScript in our page using a script tag. Similar syntax to an image. We're going to have a script tag, except this is not self-closing, with the source equal to whatever file we want to get from the server. We can write JavaScript right here. It's bad practice. Store your JavaScript in a separate file, and then include that file to keep your JavaScript, your CSS, and your HTML all separate. They have 3 different goals. Keep them separate. Keep your project organized. So this is going to make a request for that script, and we usually put this at the end of our body. There are different ways to solve this problem, but we don't want the script, like this script runs as soon as it's downloaded. And if this script runs before the element named myDiv exists, this script doesn't do anything. It doesn't find that element, and we'll get an error. So we want to make sure this div loads before the script. We can do that by putting it at the bottom of the body. I have also seen you can do the keyword defer right here and then put this in the head. There are various ways to do it. Or put this in a function, probably my favorite way to do it. Put this in a function, and then in the body put an onload attribute, which calls that function after the body is done loading. But any way you solve it, you need this script to run after, if the script runs immediately when it downloads. Get this script running after the page loads. The thing I forgot, the ID of my div, it's common to do this. This is the important thing that I forgot. It's common to do this. We have a div that's just empty. You saw it in my HTML slides. We have an empty div. Why the hell would we have an empty div? It doesn't make sense. If we have an empty div with an ID, Whenever you see this, typically that means we have some JavaScript that's going to populate that div later on. The JavaScript is going to grab that div and do whatever JavaScript's going to do with that div. So we'll see this pattern quite a bit. That's what the page looks like. So JavaScript is event-based, which makes it really handy to work with. This is how we get concurrency in the front end. JavaScript is built with concurrency in mind, using this event-based architecture, something that you've probably seen in 1.16. I would assume you've all taken it well. We still covered that. So if we have a div here, we can have this div react to certain events that occur in the browser. There are all kinds of event types. Here I'm using onMouseEnter and onMouseLeave. That means whenever the mouse enters into that div, we're going to call one function. We're going to call this makeBlue and pass a reference of that div to the function. And whenever it leaves, we're going to call makeGreen on this. So whenever our mouse is in the div, it should be blue. And whenever our mouse exits it, it should turn green. We can listen to mouse clicks. We can listen to keyboard inputs. We can listen to mouse move if you want, like the mouse where it has a trail of mice behind it that lasts for a certain amount of time. You want to build something like that, do onMouse move. All kinds of different events that you can listen for. On-page load, things like that. All kinds of different events. By tying into these events, we can really build some dynamic pages. We can have a lot of cool stuff going on our pages. So we're going to call our JavaScript when events occur, and most events are the user did a thing, react to what the user did. The user typing into a text box. You have the password criteria where it shows as you're typing what password criteria are met and which are not met. They're listening for keyboard inputs and changes to that text box, and then as you make changes, it's calling its password verification code and then updating the HTML elements that display which criteria you've met or not. It's all tying into JavaScript events. The browser console is your friend. We've looked at this quite a bit already this semester, so I don't want to talk about it too much. But browser console is going to be your best friend in this course. Use that browser console. We've used the network tab quite a bit. Hopefully you've used the network tab a lot to get homework 1 done. Hopefully you have homework 1 done by now. But there's also the console. I never know what to call this because I call the whole thing the browser console, but there's also a console tab, which is where whenever you use console.log in your JavaScript, that's where those logs are going to go. This is where you're going to see any JavaScript error messages. And this is where you can type your own JavaScript. If you have something going on your page and you want to just quick without editing your script and relaunching your site and refreshing, you just want to write a line of JavaScript and see what it does, just type it in the browser console and run that one line. Or if you're on a page that is not yours and you want to run some JavaScript on that code, you can open up that console and run any JavaScript you want on that page. Which we'll do. I'll do that demo. I think it'll be in a couple weeks. I think I'll rearrange it a little bit. But then you can also write browser extensions. What browser extensions are is JavaScript that runs after a page loads when you visit a page. So you can open up the browser console and run all kinds of JavaScript that does whatever you want to a page that you're visiting. But that gets tedious. A browser extension automates that process and says, this whole script, run it every time I visit this page. Automate that whole thing. And this is how something like an ad blocker works. An ad blocker is a browser extension, just a whole bunch of JavaScript that runs after the page loads, looks for ads, and rips them out of there, just deletes them. Looks for any elements that look like an ad, blocks them. So probably in 2 weeks, I'll do a browser extension demo. And we got front end done in a day. Everything you wanted to know about front end, right? And with that, yeah, see everyone Friday. Have a good day.